I'm Dom Nicholls, and this is Ukraine the Latest. Today, as military and political chiefs from the Coalition of the Willing meet in Paris, President Zelensky continues to reshuffle his top team, including with the replacement of the man behind Operation Spiderweb, a move that has been criticised in Ukraine. We have a look at how 2026 is being reported in the Russian media, and later we speak to an analyst from RAND about how AI is now being fielded on drones in the war.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
Russia does not want peace.
Erstens, wir verteidigen mit unserer Hilfe für die Ukraine auch unsere Freiheit und unsere europäischen Werte.
If I'm president, I will have that war settled in one day, 24 hours.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Tuesday, the 6th of January, 3 years and 318 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined by the Telegraph's foreign correspondent Lily Shanagher and analyst at RAND, Michael Bohnert. I started with the emerging news from Paris. Now, the main event today is the Ukraine summit at the Élysée Palace in Paris. 35 countries expected to be represented there, 27 at leader level. NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte also going to be there. Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner expected to be there representing the United States. President Zelensky's arrived this morning, the last few hours, accompanied by Kirill Bohnert in what I think is Mr. Bohnert's first international outing as the presidential chief of staff. Now, the military heads of Ukraine, the UK and France have had a meeting already during which they discussed implementing what they say are the modalities of security guarantees for Kyiv ahead of the main leaders' summit. I've no idea what they mean by modalities either. If anyone's got a clue, please do let me know. Anyway, the French Chief of the Defence Staff, Fabien Mandon, said the ongoing military work carried out for months with our coalition and in coordination with the United States supports the political efforts to establish lasting peace on our continent. Not sure we learned a great deal from that. Anyway, Reuters are reporting that there's a draft statement by the coalition in circulation, yet to be approved by the leaders, but said to include binding commitments by members to support Ukraine in the event of any future Russian attack. Now, these commitments are said by Reuters to include military capabilities, intelligence and logistical support, diplomatic initiatives and adoption of additional sanctions. Like I say, that's a draft that's been seen by Reuters, so it may well change by the time it comes out later. Sophie Pedder, who's Paris bureau chief for The Economist, says French officials sound cautiously optimistic about what they call is convergence on security guarantees for Ukraine. I dislike the phrase cautiously optimistic. I know it's used a lot. I heard it too many times in Afghanistan. In my opinion, it's an attempt to sound upbeat by military and diplomatic folk who are pointedly ignoring all the available evidence. Anyway, I'm sorry about that. I'm just a bit glass half empty, vodka glass half empty right now. Anyway, the Élysée Palace says that today's summit is going to finalise the work undertaken on security guarantees for Ukraine, specifying the contributions of the different participating states. I think the words finalise and specifying in that sentence doing a lot of the heavy lifting. Anyway, if we see any updates from Paris and the timings for how the day is going to go, a little bit later from Lily, and I will get on with the military updates or the Ukraine-specific updates. Because President Zelensky yesterday announced further personnel changes within his team, both the government and security services. Vasyl Malyuk, who's the architect of Operation Spiderweb, is going to be stepping down from his position as the head of the SBU, the security service of Ukraine. Now, that move has drawn criticism from a number of people in the country. President Zelensky said that Mr. Malyuk will continue to oversee special operations within the SBU, but did not confirm what position he's going to hold going forward. The President said Mr. Malyuk knows how to do this best and will continue within the SBU system. Then in a statement, Vasyl Malyuk said he would stay in the SBU to carry out what he described as world-class asymmetric operations aimed at inflicting, quote, maximum damage on Moscow. His departure follows days of speculation that President Zelensky was preparing to dismiss him or move him on. Now, President Zelensky has appointed in his place Major General Yevgeny Kamara. He's going to be acting head until either he or someone else is named permanent position. Mr. Kamara currently serves as the head of Special Ops Alpha. in the SBU. And then also yesterday, in a bit of a blast from the past, actually, former Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba, he popped up. He had a separate meeting with President Zelensky, who said afterwards, "I'm glad that Dmytro is part of Ukraine's team." Now, you remember he was moved on or sought other opportunities, moved on from foreign minister some time ago. It was rumored that he'd fallen out of favour or done his time. Anyway, he's now sort of back and very publicly shown as well. It remains unclear what role he's going to take, a former diplomat, where he's going to fit in the current government reshuffle. Interesting character. Mr. Kuleba has previously publicly called for Ukraine to concede land under the, if you remember, the original 28-point peace document proposed by Russia, delivered by the United States. Now, whether that was just the de facto recognition of the occupied areas of Ukraine or more, he didn't opine, but I'm sure he'll be asked on it again. Now, in the last 24 hours, 61 drones were fired by Russia at Ukraine. 8 got through air defences, causing damage across the country. On the ground, no great moves, but a few things to bring to your attention. So go to the northeast of the country. Ukraine's Border Guard Service spokesperson, Andrei Demchenko, he was on national TV yesterday. He said that Russia is trying to expand the combat zone in the border areas of Sumy and Kharkiv oblasts. He said it was most active in Sumy, but you'll remember we had that report yesterday in the Vovchansk area, so sort of 20 k's-ish north of Kharkiv, saying that Russian forces were trying to push around, trying to get round to the east, without luck, but without any movement there. But they're seemingly continuing trying to get that, what they call the buffer zones along the border. Now, go a little bit further east, and Ukraine's 7th Rapid Response Corps said yesterday that they'd thwarted Russia's latest attempt to launch an attack in the Kupiansk area in northeastern Kharkiv Oblast by using the Soyuz gas pipeline. Now, Russia attempted to use the pipeline, we're told, for a covert exit and further accumulation of forces. This is about 30 k's south of Kupiansk city itself. Most of the people there, the 7th Corps said, were eliminated. Now, head south from there, and 7th Rapid Response Corps also commenting, said that Russia has increased pressure in the Pokrovsk area. They say they're working in conjunction with the 14th Operational Brigade of Ukraine's National Guard, and they're concentrating on securing the northern part of Minorad. Remember, that's about 5 k's east of Pokrovsk. They are containing, they say, Russian forces in the central areas of the town and preventing them from bringing equipment in from the south. That's quite an interesting comment, I thought, because the southern flank is open to Russian-held areas of Ukraine. So to be able to say that you are stopping Russia bringing in equipment from the south is quite a claim. Now then, in the centre of the country, an oil extraction plant in Dnipro was damaged by a Russian drone strike yesterday, spilt 300 tons of sunflower oil across the city, Mayor Boris Filatov said. He added he thought the plant belonged to a large US agribusiness company based in Missouri. Then further north in Kyiv, in the city, the UN's Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine visited the site of Russia's Sunday night attack on the medical facility in Kyiv that we reported on yesterday. The US team said that witnesses had told them that 26 patients were present in the hospital at the time of that attack. 1 male patient was killed, at least 1 female patient injured. All patients had to be transferred to other medical institutions. Still sticking in Kyiv, and a 24-year-old woman has been arrested and detained, suspected of blowing up that car on Sunday morning belonging to a Ukrainian National Guard soldier that we reported on yesterday as well. You'll remember the soldier opened the boot of the car and then there was a blast. He was injured. A nearby member of the public was also injured. That attack has been classified as a terrorist act, and the woman being held faces up to 10 years in prison. Then in Russia, a number of Telegram channels reporting Ukrainian drone strikes across the country carried out last night across several regions, resulting in a number of explosions and widespread fires. Russian MOD said 129 drones were shot down across the country. They didn't give any figures for any that got through, but 1 person was reportedly killed after a drone was said to have hit a high-rise building in the city of Tver. That's about 100 k's northwest of Moscow. Although the local governor there, Vitaly Korolev, said later this morning that had been the result of a gas pipe explosion, not a drone strike. He said that had caused the apartment fire and killed the resident. Also, an industrial plant in Penza was hit. That's 500 k's southeast of Moscow, near the border with Kazakhstan. Social media posts showed a large fire also at an oil refinery in Uzman. That's about halfway between Kharkiv and Moscow. And explosions also heard in Stelychamak. That's about 1,000 k's northeast of Ukraine. Although As the Kyiv Independent, from where a lot of this reporting comes, says, the target in that last one, Stolitomak, remains unclear. Now, outside the country, one thing to bring to your attention, and there's been another incident of potentially deliberate damage to undersea cables in the Baltic Sea. The head of Lithuania's National Crisis Management Centre said yesterday that his organisation are working jointly with Latvian authorities to investigate an incident that happened on Friday night. This is separate to the incident on New Year's Eve, December 31st, that resulted in Finnish forces boarding the ship, the Fitberg. That's a ship carrying sanctioned Russian steel products from St. Petersburg, that caused another anchor-dragging incident, cutting a cable. So 2 just in the last week. Now, that's the military updates. Lily, delighted to have you back. Thank you so much for coming into diplomatic updates today. Going to ask you, after you've gone through the updates, ask for your opinion. Having spent time in the country, I'm going to ask you how worried authorities in Cuba should be after the US action in Venezuela and Trump's comments that we think have got some folk worried in Havana. But first, what have you been looking at on the political front, and what's the latest news? How's the day going to go in the Élysée Palace in Paris? Hi, Lily.
Hello, and thank you for having me on. Yes, so we're still kind of waiting to see what's going to take place, keeping you there with updates. As we know, 27 members of the Coalition of the Willing are going to be in Paris at the level of heads of state and government from 35 countries and international organisations. So far, we've seen Trump's envoys Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff arrive at the Élysée Presidential Palace for preparatory talks, and these kind of sideline meetings around the actual coalition general meeting imply it's going to be an intense diplomatic effort. Zelensky has announced that he's arrived for a meeting with Macron, and he's going to join up with the US team after for a working lunch. Then there should be a news conference including Zelensky, Macron, Keir Starmer and German Chancellor Friedrich Merz later this evening. A separate meeting is scheduled to take place this afternoon between Zelensky, Kushner, Witkoff and other US and Ukrainian delegates. And we've also had a bilateral meeting with Zelensky and Macron ahead of these talks, which will take place in about an hour. So this is the first time since March 27 last year that the Coalition of the Willing is meeting with all members present in Paris. And it's going to be quite an intense effort, as I've said. Unfortunately, though, I think it will be overshadowed somewhat by recent days. Already I'm seeing in the updates that a lot of the comments being released by leaders centre around Trump's threats over annexing Greenland, and he's likely to be distracted with what's just happened in Venezuela. For example, Macron's office said Marco Rubio, the US Secretary of State, was initially meant to have led the US delegation, but he's now changed his plans for obvious reason. But Zelensky is putting on a positive front. He's already posted a video of him arriving off the plane in the freezing cold and shaking hands with officials in France. And he said on Twitter, there will be important talks here at the level of the leaders of the Coalition of the Willing with the Secretary General of NATO, as well as a meeting with representatives of the American negotiating team. He said that these talks are meant to deliver more protection and strength for Ukraine. And he said that he's counting on his partner's support and on steps that can guarantee real security for our people. As you've mentioned before, they're seeking concrete outcomes on 5 key priorities. So they want ways to monitor a ceasefire, participants. They want support for Ukraine's armed forces, deployment of a multinational force on land, at sea and in the air, commitments in case of another Russian aggression, and long-term defence cooperation with Ukraine. So we'll just have to see how that goes as the day goes on ahead. In other diplomatic news, Zelensky has appointed a new advisor on economic development, a move he says will help strengthen the internal resilience of the war-torn nation. The advisor in question is Canada's former Finance Minister, Freeland. She's a former journalist who served in cabinet roles under former Canadian PM Justin Trudeau and under Carney as well. She was Finance and Deputy Prime Minister under Trudeau, but clashed with him over economic matters and resigned in December 2024. That actually snowballed into Trudeau's eventual resignation when she accused him in her public resignation letter of failing to take the threat of US tariffs seriously. She's a very interesting person. She seems to be a major player in Canadian politics and economics. She was the first woman finance minister. She managed Canada's financial response to the COVID pandemic and is also credited with helping renegotiate the current free trade agreement between Canada, the US and Mexico during Trump's first term. She has a long history connected to Ukraine and Russia and has historical ties to Ukraine. When she was an exchange student in Ukraine, she was a bit of an activist during the Soviet period. And according to The Guardian, the KGB actually caught wind of her pro-democracy work and targeted her with smear campaigns. They gave her a codename Frida and surveilled her, and she said she was eventually forced to leave the country. Later in the 90s...
Hang on, so her name's Christy Freeland, and they came up with the codename Frida.
Frida, like Carlo, perhaps.
Right.
But yeah, so she's, been involved in this kind of activism and had a pro-Ukrainian stance for a long time. In the 90s, she then worked for the FT in Russia and was actually later placed on Kremlin list of Westerners banned from entering Russia in retaliation for sanctions against Moscow. This comes amid a reshuffle of Zelensky's government. As you already know, he's already replaced a number of key figures and is interested in appointing advisors like Freeland who speak Ukrainian and advocate for the country and its economy. Freeland has posted a statement on Twitter, on X. She said, "Ukraine is at the forefront of today's global fight for democracy, and I welcome this chance to contribute on an unpaid basis as an economic advisor to Zelensky." She's also announced that she will leave her seat in Parliament and expressed quite a lot of enthusiasm about improving the economic situation in Ukraine, which she has called the next battlefield. She said Ukraine has the opportunity to turn the courage, patriotism and entrepreneurial spirit it has demonstrated over 4 years of war to the equally essential mission of economic renewal. So it's good for Ukraine, but the Kremlin doesn't seem to be too happy about this appointment. I've looked at the state news agency TASS earlier today, which, along with the news, it's banned entry to 28 Canadian nationals for allegedly supporting neo-Nazism. They've linked it to the appointment of Chrystia Freeland. They said the sanctioned individuals, in quotes, by ignoring the historical facts and truths about the events of the Great Patriotic War, have been struggling to strengthen Canada's ties with the most radical and uncompromising nationalists in Ukraine. And they've said that she is the daughter of who Russia's MFA called Hitler's henchman, Mikhail Khomyak. There have been reports as further proof of this trend, according to the Foreign Ministry. There have been reports that Freeland's grandfather, Mikhail Khomyak, had ties to the Nazis and that he was the editor of a Nazi-aligned newspaper, but these have been dismissed by Freeland and others. So we will just have to see how that plays out.
I didn't know it was an unpaid post. That's interesting.
Yes, it is. And she's also taking up a role of chief executive of the Rhodes Scholarship in Oxford University at the same time. So she's going to be across countries and she's going to have her hands full. Busy.
Now, very jealous now. You're one step ahead of us all here because you speak Russian. So using your superpower and having a quick scan around the Russian media, what's caught your eye? How's Russia reacting to events in Venezuela and elsewhere and stuff in Paris? What have you seen in the Russian media?
So perhaps they're just jealous, but Russian senators are supposedly already throwing doubt on Trump's actions in Venezuela. As TASS agency reports, Russian senator said that the temporary US triumph in Venezuela could turn into a disaster. Pushkov said that Trump's actions, and especially his statements, cannot be denied their effectiveness. Their efficiency is another matter. Previous US presidents were also delighted with their victories in Iraq, Afghanistan and Libya. They were all eager to announce their victories, but ultimately they turned into either defeat, as in Afghanistan, or disaster, as in Libya and Iraq, where the US became mired for many years. In his opinion, by attacking Venezuela and capturing its president, the US has violated all norms and, quotes, returned it to the savage imperialism of the 19th century. What will be the end result, he's asked? Won't the triumph turn into disaster? As you've already spoken about, Trump's arguably successful capture of Maduro has led many in the Kremlin to be somewhat jealous that their attempts did not go anywhere near as smoothly.
Yeah, the Russian mill blogger community have been very vocal about how, from a purely military perspective, the operation was a success, and they're contrasting that with the Russian VDV, the Airborne Forces assault on Hostomel in the opening hours of after the full-scale invasion, which didn't go according to plan. Interesting. Now then, as I said at the start, you've also spent time in Cuba. You've been around Russian-speaking Cuba. Okay, very, very interesting. So speaking to people there, your knowledge of the country and speaking to people about there, how, just a brief segue, this is tangentially related to Ukraine, but as I knew you'd been there, you had to pick your brains. What's the reaction been there to the events in Venezuela, and how worried do you think people there from the official side of the house should be?
Yeah, so Cubans are worried, and one could say for good reason, not just that Trump has said it's going down for the count, and Marco Rubio has said, if I lived in Havana and I was in the government, I'd be concerned at least a little bit. This could indeed be the start of its next special period, which was the period of hardship in the 90s when the USSR collapsed. There was a huge protest in front of the US Embassy in Havana in response to Venezuela, which the strike also killed 32 Cubans. And President Miguel Díaz-Canel has put on a defiant show of support for Venezuela. But what the government says and what the people are saying seem to clash slightly. CNN Havana bureau chief Patrick Ottman spoke to residents for an article, and one voiced these somewhat unspoken fears about the David and Goliath battle Cuba would have against Trump, which has only been strengthened since he hired Rubio, who famously hates the Cuban Communist government. I myself was speaking with friends in Cuba and asking them if they were okay in the aftermath of the attack in Venezuela, and one said, Cuba wants a change, but not one with firearms nor US intervention. Trump is a destructor and everything has to be done to please him. Here there is a lot of worry and tension among the people. Rumours spread that they will then enter into Cuba. But another said that he wants Trump to come to Cuba. He said of the government, they're bad people. The situation in Cuba is hard and it is all their fault. They only have one justification, the anti-blockade, although he is anti-communist. I mean, the Cubans and Venezuela had a very symbiotic partnership. They exchanged oil for healthcare, professionals, intelligence and military support. Maduro's inner circle, a lot of them were Cuban. But now Cuba has lost one of its biggest allies and its biggest provider of oil, which is one of the most important issues. And I was wondering, will Cuba turn more to Russia, long been a staunch and historic ally, and would Russia be able to intervene to defend it?
Well, interesting question. I suppose recent experience from Venezuela and Syria and Mali and a lot of Russian towns last night would suggest no, they can't. But anyway, that's not for me to answer. When were you there? When were you in Cuba?
I was there August 2024.
All right, okay.
Yeah.
Well, isn't it? Interesting. Thanks, Lee. We'll come back to you a bit later for final thoughts. Delighted now to turn to our guest, Michael Bohnert of the RAND Corporation in the US. Michael, always a pleasure to speak to you. Your depth of knowledge about the military aspects of this war are very impressive, which is why we try to keep squeezing you. I'd be particularly keen to, chat about a number of things. Drones in particular. I want to start with drones, if I may. The evolution of drones, both the capacity and the counter-drone technology. But I note that on Sunday, Ukrainian electronic warfare expert Sergei Flash Beskrensov released footage of a down-Shahed drone, which was equipped with a MANPAD, Man-Portable Air Defence System, said to be operating as a remotely launched short-range air defence system. So Flash said that Russian forces had fielded these modified drones for the first time overnight, Saturday, Sunday, just gone. Now, when I saw that, I thought it just sounds too random, sticking a MANPAD on a drone. I mean, the accuracy's got to be limited, I would imagine. So if you could start with that, how big a threat do you think that is? And where are we at the moment in terms of drone technology? Hello, Michael.
Good morning, or I guess good afternoon, Dom, and thank you for having me. It's not the first time there's been a MANPAD on the drone. The U.S. did it once, just to prove we could in Iraq. That being said, it missed. But you're right, the accuracy of it is probably pretty low. At the same time, more modern MANPADs with their seeking capabilities don't require nearly as capable launchers. So I don't think it would be terribly different than an untrained 18-year-old using the MANPAD. So it might be useful, although MANPADs are relatively expensive. So if you're using them to down another drone, it's probably not a good cost exchange. If you're using them to go after helicopters, that's a different story. But I think overall, this isn't a radical change in terms of a battlefield impact.
Yeah, I think the report that I saw from Sergei was that it was aimed at the helicopters that are themselves trying to shoot down Russian drones going into the country. So it may be more effective against the relatively slower moving helicopters than fast jets. So sticking with drones and evolution, we've spoken in the past about the incorporation of artificial intelligence on drones for targeting. So the drone would know the difference between a tank and a bus or what have you, and be able to target itself if it lost the signal back to a controller. Where are we? Is AI now a thing on drones? Is that a mature capability? How far advanced is that?
So as longtime listeners have probably heard me drone on for the past year and a half, I've been saying automated targeting and pathfinding is going to be something we would have seen in 2025. My argument then was what Android and iPhone had already done with facial recognition, vehicle recognition, and non-GPS waypoints would be in 6 to 12 months. Good news is the New York Times actually has an amazing article they just put out on the evolution of this capability. But basically in the summer, we started seeing automation in drones, whether it was pathfinding because they were worried about GPS jamming, or whether it was in the last few hundred meters, letting the drone take over and hit targets. Now that's from the perspective of automation. So AI is something a little bit different where it's doing a much greater degree of autonomy. So we are seeing that. I mean, that technology is already there now in more commercial applications. So these are used for priority targets, for the ones that are the highest impact, best defended, because these are more exquisite systems. Further, every increasing complexity of automation requires more energy. So you're losing either munition payload or battery space. So either you have a little less boom, a little less range, or a much expensive drone. But we're definitely going to see more drones with a higher degree of automation and a higher degree of AI going forward. There is a lot of resistance of people realizing this is a Pandora's box because we're not too far away from the ability to target individual people. Right now, Ukraine has been very effective at taking out Russian generals. With AI-enabled drones, we're not too far from that being able to happen from far away. But overall, we're definitely seeing that. Although one other part of this drone evolution to think about is just the overall increase of sensing on drones. I've heard from a few people that have been in the Donbass where Russians are now using Shaheds in a more tactical manner. They've put sensors on the Shaheds, live data links, and some automation where they're flying them overhead. And when there's targets of interest, they pounce. The difference is a Shahed can be in the air for several hours, where quadcopters for a much shorter period. So that is one other aspect, is it makes your drones more expensive, but then operating for longer. Where we're also seeing this on the defensive front is right now, these defensive drones are being fielded by Ukraine, and they'll probably be fielded by Russia at some point. They're designed to hit Shaheds and other sort of higher-end strike drones. As they came out, they were one pilot, one drone, which means you need a lot of pilots to defend Ukraine. Well, as we're seeing more AI and you can connect to, Amazon Web Service and other major providers, those systems are going to be able to become automated, which means one person will be in charge of thousands of drones and able to intercept a greater variety while using less manpower. That's going to be easier when defending cities because you can connect to national grids. You don't have that power problem I mentioned. Where in the more tactical level, where everything has to be on board the drone, it's going to be a little slower to see that degree of adoption of dozens of drones with a very complicated AI integration. That being said, Pandora's box is already opening, and we're going to see more and more of this. And sadly, 2026 could be a very scary year when it comes to automated and AI drones.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. And I should say, and Ruth, thank you for nudging us, explain MANPAD. So when we talk about MANPADs, it's man-portable air defence. So it's a shoulder-launched missile for bringing down helicopters, jets, and that kind of thing. So, Michael, stop me if I'm getting too complex. But you'll have an individual soldier who can fire one of these things, and they are fire and forget. I don't think there's many that can actually be reloaded with another munition up the tube, but they are individual weapons for point defence, generally, as the name says, sort of man-portable air defence, so short range, low height against low-flying helicopters and jets, that kind of thing. So my question earlier on to Michael, sticking one of these things, it's one thing for the operator on the ground, let's say, to target the aircraft, and they might be using thermal or for whatever other targeting system, but the missile itself being fired off a drone, I thought was just going to be so inaccurate as to not make the whole thing worthwhile. But Ruth, thank you for nudging us. Sorry that we were talking in jargonese. So in terms of the balance between drone and counter-drone technology, one's always got the slightly upper hand. Where are we at the moment? Where is the balance? Or possibly more importantly, where's the momentum? Is it in the drone race or the counter-drone race, would you say?
So I think on the strike drone side, as we're seeing those defensive drones I just mentioned, now those are being ramped up. They're much cheaper and they can be built faster than, say, a Shahed. So I think for some of the strategic defense, that drone race is much faster. When it comes to on the battlefield with the individual troops, it does seem like those drones are iterating much more quickly. That being said, we are seeing low-cost defensive systems that are basically bolt-on. So you can literally, as it stands, bolt it to the top of a vehicle. Those are starting to get produced. They're not really in big enough numbers, but their costs are in a few thousand. They're propeller-based missiles, which is different. But I think on the tactical side, we might start seeing a little better on the defensive. But that probably from a mass perspective is not going to overcome the increase in volume of AI.
Thank you. Now, moving on a little bit away from drones per se, but air defence more broadly, interested in your views on where we are in terms of technology, so the quality rather than quantity of air defence. And also looking at Ukraine, we're told there's about 30 Flamingo cruise missiles being produced a month by Ukraine, in which case I would ask the question, why aren't we seeing more damage? Or is it just taking, when we talk about these strikes, as I did in the updates earlier on, when I talk about an oil refinery hit, I mean, is it taking a lot of missiles to get through the air defence or any other protection around these sites? Why aren't we seeing more damage with all these Flamingos being built?
So I think that's the million-dollar question right now. I mean, if anyone wants to hear the nitty-gritty of getting through some of the air defenses, the Rusi paper by Jack Watling you've talked about does a great public overview. Looking at a Flamingo, it would very clearly stick out like a sore thumb on radar. It's a very basic, basically a 1950s cruise missile. The question that I've yet to see any evidence that they've been fired at anything and any evidence they've hit anything. I assume if one had been shot down, Russian media would have shown all sorts of pictures of it everywhere. So the question is, have they been used, or Ukraine could be planning and stockpiling for a large strike? So it's been reported that basically 1 in 10 of the smaller drones get through. If you think about, these are probably going to have a high attrition rate. You're, instead of firing 1 or 2 where maybe they occasionally get through, if you fire 20, 5, 6, or 7 might get through. So your odds increase the more you fire at the same time. So at 30 per month, that's kind of low. I can see Ukraine saving them up for a couple big strikes here in the coming weeks. I can't confirm that. I have no evidence, but given that I haven't seen them employed yet, that's one option. The other option is navigation is always tricky. And whether it's GPS jamming or guidance, these move much faster than the propeller-based drones, which makes navigation a lot more difficult in general. So it could be that there might be a time lag between Ukraine having the physical missiles and having the whole guidance, command and control infrastructure to utilize them. That's a bit of a speculation, but that is something that's been historically problematic for high-speed missile development.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right there when you say if any of them have been shot down, and you have to assume that some would be lost when they were used, we would see it straight away on the Russian media. So I can only assume there that you're absolutely on the money when you say they've probably not been employed yet, which is interesting. Now, talking about this proposed ceasefire, peace, etc., you know I'm pretty lukewarm about the prospects of any ceasefire in the near term. But there's talk of having remote systems to monitor any demilitarized zone if Russia and Ukraine had to pull their troops back from, let's say, the line of contact. What's the feasibility of using autonomous systems, do you think, audio, visual, other kind of sensors to monitor a demilitarized zone? Is this just a bluff to say we don't need so many troops because they might think they're not going to be able to get so many troops? Or is it a realistic proposition?
I mean, any DMZ is hard to manage. I mean, look how small the DMZ is between North and South Korea, and at the same time, how many tens of thousands of troops it takes to monitor that on a daily basis. So there's going to have to be some high degree of automation to maintain a DMZ. And as was discussed with Venezuela that we might touch on later, there was comments about weather, where if you're trying to do everything from space, for instance, well, clouds are real, and clouds prevent visual satellites. And radar from space is not like a perfect picture. It's more than a blob, but it's almost more like a shadow. So you're going to have some degree of close-up observation. And having things like Global Hawks, so these very high-altitude drones from far away, are useful, but they don't always come in at the right angle to see something. Trees exist, buildings exist. So at some point, there will be a need for eyes into a DMZ, and likely won't be armed troops, due terms of DMZs, etc. So there's going to have to be some incorporation of drones at some point. However, understanding how to handle that when there will be jamming, when there might be malfunctions of the drones for accidents, when there's power limitations, loss of communications, those are all concerns. So there's going to have to be some degree of automation and some degree of AI. as well as processing data and sharing data where it's believable to all partners. So that's a very complex challenge over a 1,000-mile front. It's going to take a lot of drones, a lot of people, a lot of processing, and a lot of trust in visual information, which in today's AI world is going to be problematic. So that's a new dimension where it's no longer just people drawing on a photograph. It's these AI high-quality deepfakes. So I'm worried, but I also don't see a way to do it without drones. But there's going to be a lot of trial and error when this happens. And sadly, we're probably going to see some tense situations, particularly in the early 6 months to a year of any DMZ.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And the idea there of deep fakes, I'm sure there will be a lot. If there is a ceasefire and there is a demilitarized zone, then yeah, stand by for some probably very credible looking imagery of incursions from up and down the line. Interesting. We'll keep an eye out for those. Now, last one for me, please. I can't let you go. I know, Ukraine the latest. However, I've got to ask you about Venezuela. How did the US forces get in and out unscathed? Electronic warfare jamming is one thing, but the simple manpads we were speaking of earlier should have shot down some of those Chinooks. They were low, not particularly fast. They were obvious, one after the other, hey diddle diddle, Chinooks up the middle. How the hell did the US get in and out unscathed, Michael?
Dom, I'm sure being a former Gazelle pilot, you were white-knuckled seeing a couple of the videos. And this is actually where I'm going to kind of do a little compare and contrast to Kyiv here. So in many ways, Venezuela and Ukraine had kind of a similar mix of air defenses. Now, one thing that was different was Ukraine's had an integrated network that were mostly the same producer. Venezuela had a hodgepodge of Russian and Chinese systems, but most of those were around the Caracas region. So it was a high density and probably not terribly different than Kyiv to start with. What is a little bit different, we got to set the scene that the U.S. has been broadcasting this for several months. And so, if you're Venezuela, you've had all of these systems in high readiness, which means your soldiers have been sitting behind the screens watching blankly for months on end. People get lax, people get desensitized, they're not getting training, the air defenses aren't getting their routine maintenance because they're all watching. Factor in the holidays and you have a lower readiness air defense network. And as mentioned, it's a hodgepodge of systems, so command and control might not be as good. That's on the Venezuela demand side, which is a little bit different from Ukraine, as it's a shorter run-up. They were on readiness for a shorter period of time, which meant probably a little bit higher. Now, looking at the U.S. aspect, the U.S. we spend a lot of money on command and control and coordinating. And the special operations community in particular works with all the services to make sure everything works correctly. So the U.S. had what we call a package of various assets, or as Dom normally says, the symphony of airborne planes that act as the controller for everybody, certain aircraft that have a role taking down air defenses, some flying overhead, and then that's all before the helicopters come through. So there's some really great videos on the web where you see the whole kind of mountain range between Caracas and the sea, and all of a sudden 20 or 30 targets blow up. That's what we would call a seed campaign or suppression of enemy air defenses, where the U.S. took all of those main air defenses out immediately in one fell swoop. And then there's images of Blackhawks heading forward, and when they had manpads shot at them, you'll see what looks like fireworks coming out of the helicopters. Those are chaff and flares. Chaff tends to disrupt infrared radar. Flares tend to disrupt infrared. So as they were shot at, they had those defensive systems, and then they very quickly fired back at whatever manpads were shooting at them. Once again, there are some very detailed, multi-minute long images of this. So then you see those Chinooks that are basically flying pigs. They're big, they have vehicles come out. After all of this has already happened, the stage has been set, and they come through in an area that it's been, as we would normally say, whether it's sanitized or defended, that's happened. So they already had gone through Dom at that point. That being said, when they were leaving, they were getting shot at. So Venezuela was actively responding. Another part I want to mention here is several of the ground force bases were hit early on. So Venezuela, not the safest place, has some corruption issues, etc. You're not going to just leave manpads out in the open with soldiers. There's a risk of them getting stolen, sold, There's groups there that would love to have man pads. And so they probably were centrally stored. So by taking out those munitions storage areas early on, Venezuela probably wasn't able to distribute man pads as quickly or as broadly as they would have liked to. And given that, you look at Kyiv, mostly flat terrain, good highways, relatively reliable bridges. Caracas is very infrastructure poor as a city. So its roads are a mess. Its bridges are a mess. So if you were trying to distribute man pads from a centralized location in the U.S., our 3-hour special law enforcement operation, that it would have been very hard to distribute those man pads throughout the city in the time frame. So apologize for giving the long-winded answer, but it was a force that was had been on readiness too long against a well-trained force that knew what they were doing.
No, thanks, Michael. And I have to say, I'm loving the inter-service rivalry / bants between Delta and SEAL Team 6 in particular on social media about who would have done what and who would have missed the target. And you would have already had 5 Mark Wahlberg movies out of it about it by now, blah, blah, blah. Fascinating stuff. Lily, you've been looking at something in the last half hour while we've been on air.
Yes, so since we've been on air, obviously there have been developments with the Coalition of the Willing in Paris. So if we just go back to Paris, Zelensky has posted on X that he's had a meeting with Macron and they've discussed more defences for Ukraine, in particular further supplies of defence weapons. He posted a video of them having a very cordial hug and handshake and a conversation in the presidential palace. And he's written, "Diplomacy and real assistance must go hand in hand. Russia does not stop in its strikes against our country, and right now we need to bolster air defence to protect our people, our communities, and critical infrastructure. Every delivery of air defence missiles saves lives and boosts the chance for diplomacy." So he said, "This is why every meeting must yield concrete results, new decisions regarding air defence, new assistance packages and new capabilities to protect the skies. During our meeting with President Macron, this was exactly what we discussed." He says that these capabilities are going to be able to counter what he calls Russia terror, his defence and the support that can strengthen his positions in diplomacy. So it looks like talks are already going very positively.
Well, yes, I'm sure we wouldn't necessarily hear if they weren't. But no sign of these binding commitments yet. Thanks, Lily. Michael, always a pleasure to chat to you. Hopefully we're going to speak many more times during this year. Although I know you say 2026 is going to be a very scary year. That's somewhat disconcerting there. But where would you like to leave us with your final thoughts?
So, I'm always going to pick the side of the SEALs on this one. I love working with them. Back to our earlier question. But I do think we're in a period going forward where there's going to be a bit of a shuffling of the global matrix of who's supporting who. So if you look over the past decade and a half between Georgia, how it was beat up on by Russia, how Syria, Iran, Armenia, Venezuela, and a few others were basically not supported by Russia, who were basically allies, there aren't too many groups left that are actively supported by Russia. So you have a bit of a power vacuum of power projection where it's very clear Russia is unable to project power outside of their own borders. You have, where the U.S. has retreated, you have many other countries that also are facing a vacuum, particularly in Africa and some parts of Asia, where there's the potential for the EU and China to kind of be jockeying for who has support and who can fill that vacuum, particularly in Africa and those resources. So once again, Russia's become this very unreliable partner to almost everyone. And I'm worried as well because if you look, one common trend is a country that doesn't have the backing of a nuclear-powered state is very vulnerable. So once again, Ukraine didn't really get that much support. There's been reluctance to help because Russia, nuclear-powered states attacking it, etc. And now that we're seeing this, I'm worried, we have a very big set of power vacuums around the world. And this concept of who has nukes and giving protection, I think is going to be a bigger problem. So now if you're a country that's threatened, say Taiwan, where China's being much more aggressive than they historically have been, you have a question of, should I have my own nuclear deterrent? And if China believes Taiwan might go that path, then China has to think, well, we have to do something before they get a nuclear weapon. And so my worry going into 2026 and beyond is you have countries in a kind of multipolar vacuum that don't feel they have support, that are encouraged to get some level of deterrent, whether it's nuclear, whether it's long-range Tomahawk-like strike missiles, whether it's cheaper strike missiles, whether it's AI drones. You have a lot of countries that are very clearly thinking, how do we protect ourselves? And with all of these weapon systems, it took the US and the Soviet Union decades to come up with agreements on how do we manage escalation. And now you have a lot of countries that are going to be experimenting in these deterrence realms that don't have, the famous red phone between countries, etc. And that's very scary because now it's giving very powerful systems to people that are not experienced how to use them. So apologies for kind of the longer, kind of more dismal talking point, but that's just a worry I've had for a while that it looks like we're getting a little closer to seeing.
Yeah, it is the kind of breakout argument, isn't it? The idea of Iran nuclear technology and therefore when does Israel strike, so that's going to be writ large across the world. I guess if we talk about nuclear and we say that chemical and biological weapons were the poor man's nuke, I wonder if they're going to come back or whether we're going to be looking at, as you say, in the era of drones, whether or not there's some way of getting to a capability that would make a nuclear-powered state think twice, that's short of the development time and cost and political risk of nuclear. It's going to be a cheerful year, Michael. Thank you for your input. Join me with half a glass of vodka. But thank you for your company today. I do hope you can join us again tomorrow. From everyone here at the Telegraph newspaper in London, I wish you all a very good afternoon. Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Nicholls. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. You can also now sign up to the new Ukraine the Latest weekly newsletter. Each week, Francis and I answer your questions, provide recommended reading, and give exclusive analysis and behind-the-scenes insights, plus maps of the front lines and diagrams of weapons, to complement our daily reporting. It's free for everyone, including non-subscribers. You can find the link to sign up in the descriptions for this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine live blog on our website where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciate our work, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph so that you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You'll find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Rachel Porter. Executive producers are Francis Durnley, Louisa Wells and David Nicholls.
My name is David Nicholls. Thank you all for listening. Goodbye.